Welcome. We are very happy. Hey, we are very happy to welcome Eva Zhentner, who is a associate professor at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, but who also spent some time here in the UK. Eva, you were a lecturer at the University of York earlier in your career. So it's really nice to welcome you back. And it's a shame that you're not here in person, but I hope you can come some other time. Eva was involved for a long time in a big research project on argument structure and argument licensing, with a particular focus also on English, and that's what she's going to talk about now. And the particular topic I think you're talking about is all things prepositional, argument structures throughout the history of English. So we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me in online form, at least. I'm very sorry not to be there in person. There might be the occasional coughing during this talk. I hope you'll forgive me. And I hope you can hear me well. Yeah. All right. Then I'll start sharing my presentation, which I hope you can see well as well. So as just mentioned, what I'd like to talk about today is a lot of prepositions, essentially. So what I'd like to do is report about some issues that I've dealt with in the context of this larger project that was just mentioned, where we investigated prepositions in argument structure in present-day English, but for my part, throughout the history of English. So I'll start by giving you just a tiny overview of what I'd like to talk about today, which is first just a tiny introduction to the overall topic, a very tiny introduction to the actual project, which was called PEAS, in short, prepositions in English argument structure. And then I'd like to report on some work in progress or just about published in the form of 3 case studies. Depending on time, I might only get to 2, but we'll see about that. Right, so I'll dive right in. Prepositions are a really interesting topic as such, which has also been acknowledged in various studies. So they've been called an interesting word class, with a focus on interesting as slightly annoying, as Jackendorf also calls them. So the fact that prepositions in present-day English are a bit challenging is also reflected in these memes that you see on here, which reflect that language learners struggle quite a bit, but also native speakers and also computers in more recent times actually struggle quite a bit with a lot of features or issues pertaining to prepositions. So prepositions and prepositional phrases in argument structure are a really integral part of present-day English, but they're also a really difficult or challenging part of the language, which might not always be as present or which we might not actually be aware of that much. But I'm telling you they definitely are challenging. And that will also become apparent in the course of my talk. Now, as I said, what I'd like to talk about today, or what my focus is not present-day English prepositions, but more their diachronic development in the history of English. So I've mostly been dealing with Middle English, medieval English, but in this project, I've expanded a bit, so the data I'm going to show you is mostly from Middle English to late modern English, covering around 800 years from 1100 to 1900. Now, what's interesting about the development of English in the development of prepositions in the history of English is that they're first of all part of this general increase in more analytic structures. or that's at least what's always proposed in textbooks. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this general story that English moved from a more synthetic language, which was more reliant on case marking, inflections in general, to a more analytic language, more reliant on word order and other syntactic means like prepositions. So the general idea that's typically portrayed in textbooks as well is that prepositions in general increased in frequency and importance over time. So what supposedly happened is that prepositions were already present in older times, but they really started to increase from Middle English onwards and expanded in functions. So the general idea or claim that you can find in the literature is that prepositions started out as more adjunctival, expressing sort of more peripheral functions, like time, as in the sentence put on here, so on that day, or locations, as in Rome, or something like that. And then over time, they came to take on more core functions, more complement functions, sort of more tightly integrated functions in the verb phrase. I've given a few examples from Middle English and Late Modern English on here where you can see this. So the idea is that prepositions in earlier times were more associated, typically expressed adjunctival peripheral functions such as in this year or on that day, and then over time came to take up more tightly integrated or more core functions such as mount upon a horse, or also things like believe in someone or believe on someone's name, as in the example here. I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a second. But as part of this general increase and this expansion in functions, prepositional phrases supposedly also increasingly came into competition with noun phrases, and sometimes or often even came to replace them, or at least replace them in quite a lot of contexts. So one thing that we can see in the history of English is that in many cases where originally in Old English you'd have NP, case-marked NP objects such as believe someone or mount a horse, or also time expressions like that same year, preposition came to, if not take over, at least increase quite substantially. So in some cases, prepositional phrases even took over completely. For example, you can't use prepositional verbs like rely or insist with NP objects anymore. In other cases, such as the dative alternation, or also cases like believe, both NP and PP variants are still an option, but there's been some shifts over time. So what is interesting about the history of prepositional phrases in the history of English, in addition to just their functions as such, is this competition, this variation with nominal phrases, and the way this competition plays out over time, as well as the factors that impact the choice. So we know from previous studies like on alternations, like the dative alternations, that there's been some changes in which factors play a role in whether you take a nominal phrase or a prepositional phrase. Right, now to cut this a bit short, what's interesting about prepositions in the history of English is then that these ideas are around in textbook textbooks, and for a lot of sort of smaller phenomena, we do have quite a lot of studies, a lot of research about their history. But all in all, overall, the development of prepositions is still a kind of black box. So looking at prepositions on a larger scale as a sort of more general phenomenon has actually received quite little attention so far. And as I'll show, there's probably a reason for that, because it just doesn't make sense. But in any case, this is what we set out to do in this research project that has already been mentioned. So the outset for the PEACE project, Prepositions in English Argument Structure, was that we really wanted to provide a sounder empirical basis for all of these assumptions, that we wanted to check, do prepositional phrases, do prepositions in argument structure really come to play a greater role over time, or is the story maybe a bit more complex? And as you might have guessed, it turns out it is actually a bit more complex, and there's quite a lot of challenges that we encountered along the way. So just to give you an idea of what the sort of general basis of the project was in terms of data and methods, what we did in the historical part was we took the standard corpora for historical English, the Penn-Helsinki Corpora, for middle, early modern, and late modern English. So as I said, the project covers around 800 years, from 1100 to 1900. A lot of you will be familiar with these corpora, but just in case some of you aren't, they are reasonably large, considering that it's historical data, so around 1 to 3 million large, and they've been tagged and parsed in quite painstaking work by Anthony Kroch and Ann Taylor, among others, which allows us to search for prepositional phrases and the patterns we're interested in quite nicely. So what we did is we extracted all prepositional phrases and all nominal phrases that stand in a sister relationship to verbs from these corpora. So what we get by using the search strategy is quite a large number of instances, namely around 400,000 in total. And importantly, what we get is quite a heterogeneous set of instances. So as you can see from the example that I've put up on here, what you get is, for example, object noun phrases, as in spied the land, but also temporal noun phrases like that night, and all sorts of prepositional phrases. So something like from the 22nd day, or came among the lands, or come to an anchor, and so on and so forth. So this set of around 400,000 instances really includes NPs and PPs in various different functions, which is what we wanted, but which also imposes quite a lot of challenges on whatever you do, as I'll also point out in the following again. Right. So just to give you an idea of what the basic distribution of NPs and PPs in this dataset looks like, what you've got here is just an overview of, on the left, the overall distribution of NPs versus PPs, which is quite balanced. So we've got around 200,000 instances of nominal patterns and 200,000 of prepositional patterns. And in terms of development over time, what you see on the right is that there really is, at first glance at least, no clear development over time. So it doesn't really look like prepositional phrases on the whole are increasing substantially, but rather it's really quite balanced. So the distributions don't really change much between Middle and Late Modern English. And in between, there's quite a lot of fluctuation. So what we can see at first glance when taking this data set is really that there's no clear, straightforward move from less prepositions to more prepositions. But it seems like there's a lot of fluctuation, a lot of change, smaller change going on. And that is also going to be the main conclusion from today's talk, which is basically that the situation is a lot more complex than a straightforward move, which is also maybe unfair to expect. So maybe this result as such is not too surprising, because language is always more complex than you think, right? Anyway, as an overview of what we've done so far with this data set, we've looked into this alternation on a large scale. We've looked into how NPs versus PPs are distributed over time in several publications. We've also talked a bit about the methodology behind it, so how we extracted the data and what sort of issues pertain to that, so regarding PP attachment and all sorts of other issues to do with the corpora mainly. We've also looked a bit more into how to actually classify prepositional phrases. So how do you actually deal with this large variety of functions that prepositional phrases can take on? How do you distinguish between adjuncts and complements in a corpus? And then I've looked into various sort of smaller issues, smaller phenomena to do with prepositions. There is a study forthcoming on bare PPs, such as go to school or go to church. I've recently looked into ordering within prepositional clusters. So does location typically come before time or the other way around, and so on and so forth. I've looked into several different alternations, one of which is the so-called time alternation, so that day versus on that day, and this is also something I will talk about today. I've also looked into the so-called conative alternation, which you'll also hear about today, and then some other issues like complex prepositions and location prepositional phrases. But as I said, what I'd like to talk about today is three case studies that I've been looking at recently, which is first prepositional verbs such as insist on or rely on or laugh at. Second, this time alternation that I've just mentioned. And third, if we get to it, the conative alternation, as in kick the ball or kick at the ball. All right, so let's start with the first, which is prepositional verbs. And I'll start with a bit of introduction, so a bit of background to what prepositional verbs in present-day English actually are. So when I talk about prepositional verbs, what I mean are multi-word expressions that are not to be confounded with phrasal verbs and other verbal nominal combinations. So what I'm talking about here is verb preposition combinations such as insist on or consist of, laugh at or pray for, where a verb such as insist or consist selects an obligatory PP complement which contains a specified preposition together with its own complement, as Huddleston and Pullum define it. So what we're dealing with here is combinations which are really very restricted in their collocations. So fixed verb plus preposition combinations, meaning that insist on, in cases like insist on, the prepositional phrase is obligatory. You can't use insist without a PP, and the preposition needs to be on. It can't be in or at, and so on and so forth. Now, for such combinations, different structural analyses have been proposed. So there's a bit of a discussion of how such prepositional verbs are to be analyzed. Is it a verb plus a prepositional phrase, so a looser combination, or are we dealing with a sort of a verb that is made up of a verb and preposition followed by an NP object? So there is in the literature on prepositional verbs, there is some debate on whether this is a single syntactic and semantic unit, which has some sort of idiomatic non-compositional meaning, where the preposition can be interpreted as having a closer connection to the verb than to the rest of the clause or the phrase, or cases where the preposition really kind of forms part of the verb, belongs to the verb, and where there is greater cohesion between the verb and preposition than between the verb and the preposition and the following noun phrase. There are several arguments for this kind of analysis, such that prepositional verbs can often be substituted by simple transitive verbs, like came across a problem versus encounter a problem, and the fact that the NP complement involved here is often a role-playing true participant, whatever that means specifically. There's several other arguments that speak in favor of such analyses, such as the availability of prepositional passives, some issues with coordination, and so on and so forth, including the insertion, the non-insertion of an adverbial. But despite these sort of features that prepositional verbs typically show, when you look more closely at such instances, you find that it's actually a bit hard to make an absolute distinction between freer combinations and prepositional verbs. So what we can see in prepositional verbs is that, yes, there are a few cases where it's really clear, where this really seems like a very fixed combination, but at the same time, it seems to be a bit of a continuum, and we often can't really draw a very, very clear line. This is also reflected in the quotes that I've put on here. So in some cases, it really seems like the verb and preposition form such a very clear, close unit. In other cases, the criteria that we can use are actually a bit ambiguous, and it's very, very hard to tell which syntactic analysis is actually supported. So just to give you a few examples, I guess everyone would agree that at another time, so a time prepositional phrase used with insist, that is an adjunct, that is something very different to insist on. But when it comes to laughing, for example, it's much less clear whether laughing with someone, laughing at someone is really exactly the same as insisting on or relying on. So there's several criteria that can be applied to combinations very clearly, very straightforwardly. But there's also a lot of cases where it's a lot more fuzzy, and this is also reflected in the fact that the lists of prepositional verbs that you can find around in reference grammars or other studies differs quite a lot. So which prepositional verbs, which verbs you include, which combinations you include as prepositional verbs, which you classify as prepositional verbs, differs quite a bit between different sources. So that's one thing about present-day English prepositional verbs, this sort of fuzziness, this unclear analysis, unclear definition. When it comes to the history of English, what we know is that there is some roots of this phenomenon in Old English already, but they really seem to suddenly pop up in early Middle English, as Claridge also states. So on the whole, the appearance of such prepositional verbs on the linguistic stage seems to have been rather sudden. And the emergence is typically linked to a lot of changes that go on at the same time. So the loss of prefixed verbs, the loss of case marking, a tightening of word order, this general increase in prepositional patterns, but also language contact. So it's clear that something is going on from Middle English onwards, that we get these tighter combinations, that we get a fixation of which verbs appear with particular prepositions. What's still debated or is still unclear is what this development actually reflects. So do we actually see a sort of rebracketing, a reanalysis of phrase boundaries? Do we get evidence? Can we derive evidence from corpora that such a reanalysis has taken place, that a preposition comes to form part of the verb or not? And in this regard, there's been quite some discussion on this emergence of prepositional verbs in terms of both lexicalization and grammaticalization. So this reanalysis, this fixation, is a bit ambiguous between both processes. There's arguments for treating this as a type of lexicalization process, but there's also arguments for this to be reflective of grammaticalization processes. I won't go into detail into this here. What I'd like to do, or what I did in the study that I'm going to present, is I looked into the diachronic development of prepositional verbs starting from Middle English, because that seems to be when they really emerge. I looked at their development to late modern English to see whether there is any change in the frequency of those prepositional verbs, but most importantly in their features. So what I was interested in this study is, can we actually delineate prepositional verbs from other types of verb-preposition combinations? So do prepositional verbs have specific semantic and syntactic features that we can identify and that clearly distinguish them from complements and adjuncts? Or is there some sort of fuzziness? Is there overlap? Is there cases where we're not really sure, where there's some where they actually share features? And in addition to that, I was interested in, can we somehow find evidence for this sort of reanalysis? Can we investigate this by means of corpus data? And what I ended up doing, or what I will present, is a sort of solution to this problem, also this problem of grammaticalization versus lexicalization, in a usage-based construction grammar framework where the focus is on entrenchment and chunking as processes, and where we can unite whatever goes on in terms of so-called constructionalization. I'll get back to all of these issues in a second. First, I'm going to tell you what I actually did in this study. So again, what the data comes from this larger data set on prepositional phrases and noun phrases in the history of English. So for this particular study, I took the prepositional part only, which all in all is about 200,000 instances large. And I then narrowed this data set down to only 25 verbs, which occurred with a reasonable frequency. 50 isn't actually true, but over 30 that should be. So what I did is, on the basis of earlier historical and present-day English work, I compiled a list of verbs which are typically mentioned as having prepositional verb uses. And this is where it gets a bit tricky, because obviously that list is a bit arbitrary, and it's obviously biased towards present-day English. So all of these prepositional verbs that I investigated are still there in present-day English and are listed as prepositional verbs in present-day English, which obviously doesn't mean that in historical English there weren't any others that would be of interest. So we can talk about this later if you have any questions, but just note that I sort of pre-selected the verbs from the start, which might be a bit problematic. Anyway, what I then did is I extracted all the occurrences for these verbs. So not only prepositional verb uses, but also any other occurrences of these verbs with a prepositional phrase. To give you an example, to make this clear, what this data set includes is, for example, instances of believing in someone or something, but also instances of such prepositional verbs with other prepositions, so believe on or believe upon someone. So different prepositional types used in a prepositional verb context, but then also instances of these verbs with adjuncts. So for example, they believed at this time that something was true. Or instances of they insisted on and on the issue versus they insisted upon the issue, but also they insisted in the morning on their coffee, something like that. Right. What you get if you do it, if you proceed in this way, is a data set of around 8,600 instances. So a reasonable amount, I would say, distributed across these three time periods, so Middle English, Early Modern English, and Late Modern English. And what I did then is I coded all of these instances for different variables. So you've got information on period and lexical information, what's the verb involved, and so on and so forth. I then manually classified each instance into prepositional verb versus adjunct instance versus complement instance, which is maybe the most controversial part of this. So I imposed a three-partite classification, a three-partite distinction on the data, saying, okay, this is a prepositional verb use, this is an adjunctival use, and this is a complement use, so uses where the NP is more core, is something like an object, but which isn't really a prepositional verb. So an example would be laughing at someone would be classified as a prepositional verb, but laughing with someone would be classified as a complement, and laughing in the morning would be classified as an adjunct. Again, this is a bit problematic, especially considering that I've said earlier that it's all a bit fuzzy and in practice difficult to implement. But just bear with me. For the moment, this is what I did. Other variables that I coded for are position, so where in relation to the verb is the prepositional phrase? Does it occur after or before the verb? Is it directly after the verb or directly before, or is there something in between? So for example, an intervening argument, as in praise someone for something. Or also intervening adverbs, so laugh loudly at someone. And finally, some variables relating to the NP complements. So is the NP involved pronominal? Is it definite? And so on and so forth. Great. I analyzed the data in different ways to approach the questions I mentioned in the beginning. So one thing I did is I used multiple correspondence analysis to see to what extent these three types, prepositional, verb, adjunct, and complement, overlap, to which extent they're really distinct, which features they are associated with. And then I also looked into this question of collocational fixation between verb and prepositional. So I used transitional probabilities and entropy scores to check how closely verbs and prepositions, specific verbs and specific prepositions, how closely they are associated in individual instances, and whether that relates to prepositional verb versus adjunct versus complement use. And I hope you're still with me. I know it's a bit complex. Right. What are the results then? So what you can see on here is just the basic frequency distribution of these three types that I've mentioned. So adjuncts in purple, complements in green, and prepositional verbs in yellow. And what you can see is that there is some increase in prepositional verb uses over other uses over time. So within this set of verbs that I investigated, prepositional verbs become more frequent, meaning that laugh at someone would become more frequent over time compared to laugh at that day or at 3 o'clock. So compared to prepositional verb uses, complement uses decrease a bit, whereas adjuncts stay roughly the same. What I should point out here is that this looks quite neat if we take everything together, but importantly, individual verbs vary quite a bit. So if we distinguish, or if we look at the development of these types for individual verbs, you see that for some verbs like deal, prepositional verbs increase a lot, or laugh as well, both on the right side here. Whereas for others like hear or suffer, adjunctival uses are more frequent. So I'll come back to this towards the end, but one thing that should be kept in mind is that different lexical items really behave quite differently, even if we can see some development, some sort of whole scale development. Right. Moving on to the multiple correspondence analysis. I don't know how well you can actually see this. It's quite small, but what you can conclude, or what we can see in these graphs, is that overall these three types, adjunct, complement versus prepositional type, versus prepositional verb, they have quite clearly distinct associations. So what this tool, what this analysis allows you to do is check whether there are sort of clusters in your data, in the variables that you include. So in our case, in my case, what I investigate is, are different syntactic and semantic features sort of associated with each other? And what we find is yes. For example, as you can see on the top right of these individual graphs, pre-verbal position, for example, is typically, if you have in an instance a prepositional phrase in pre-verbal position, usually in the same instance, you also have an argument intervening between verb and preposition. At the same time, on the other hand, for example, if a prepositional phrase occurs after the verb, usually it occurs directly afterwards without any intervening argument. So this is roughly how to read these graphs. What you can do in addition then is also sort of map another variable onto that. In our case, this type of prepositional phrase, and check whether it is associated with these different variables. So what we find then is, as I said, that adjuncts as a manually imposed classification are typically associated with intervening arguments, with pre-verbal position, with intervening argument adverbs, whereas prepositional verbs are more closely associated with directly following. So the prepositional phrases and prepositional verb uses are associated with post-verbal, directly adjacent position. Complements, as you can see here, are somewhere in between. So what these graphs suggest is that adjuncts and prepositional verbs really have quite different profiles, whereas complements are somewhere in the middle. They sort of share features with both. What you can also see here is that there's some increase in this divergence, or there's some divergence over time. So in Middle English, there's still more overlap between all of these types, whereas in Late Modern English, the types are more distinct than before. So to sum up, what these graphs, even if you can't see them well, suggest is that prepositional verbs sort of developed their own more distinct profile, very different from adjuncts over time. They are already quite different in the beginning, but they even diverge further over time. Right. Now, as I said, what I did in the second step then was to check whether these associations between verbs and individual prepositions became more close over time. And I used two measures for this, namely transitional probabilities on the one hand and entropy scores on the other hand. What you see here is these transitional probability scores. So essentially that's a measure of how often does one particular preposition occur with a particular verb? How closely are they associated? And again, I distinguished between these different types here. And what you can see in these graphs is that transitional probabilities between individual verbs and prepositions are much higher with prepositional verbs than for adjuncts. So with adjuncts, in adjunct uses, you find many different prepositions, whereas with prepositional verbs, it's really one verb with one preposition. These figures suggest there's not much change over time concerning this. However, if we perform different analyses on this, including a mixed effects linear regression model, it does seem that compared to adjunct uses, prepositional verb uses become sort of more tightly associated, become more fixed over time. I'm happy to talk about the details of these graphs later on, but for now, the takeaway message of what I've just shown is that in addition to sort of diverging in terms of syntactic features like order and position in a clause, it also seems that adjuncts and prepositional verbs become more different in terms of how fixed a verb preposition combination is over time. This is also suggested by these entropy scores that I mentioned. Just very briefly, entropy refers to variability or predictability. So how variable is preposition choice with particular verbs. Higher entropy here means that one verb is found with many different prepositions, whereas low entropy means very predictable, very fixed. And again, the results nicely confirm expectations, which is that, okay, in prepositional verb uses, there is very little variability. So one verb is used with one preposition. But when it comes to adjuncts, there's a lot more variability. So adjuncts can include pretty much any preposition or a lot more. Again, in terms of change over time, we here see that there is also something going on. So again, what it looks like is that adjuncts and prepositional verbs sort of diverge more strongly over time. In the beginning, both adjuncts and prepositional verbs still show some overlap in this variability, so are still more similar, but over time, adjuncts remain variable, whereas prepositional verb uses really become very fixed. Right. So to wrap this up, what I hope to have shown in this case study is that we find an increasing association between verbs and specific prepositions over time with those prepositional verbs. So verbs like insist become more tightly associated, tightly integrated with prepositions like on, whereas other uses of insist with, for example, time, adjuncts stay more variable. In terms of, on a more theoretical level, what this suggests, I would argue, is that these prepositional verb uses, these prepositional verb combinations become increasingly chunk-like. You usually see verb and preposition occurring in direct adjacency. So the verb is always directly followed by the preposition. It's always, it's increasingly always the same preposition. So this combination comes to really behave much more like a chunk over time. I won't go into the details of how I think this can be analyzed in terms of usage-based construction grammar, because I would like to briefly talk about the second case study at least. But what I suggest we really see in this case of prepositional verbs as compared to adjunctival verb preposition combinations is an increasing entrenchment, increasing chunk-like behavior, where the verb and preposition functions as a unit, a semantic and syntactic unit. Right. So what this case study hopefully has quickly shown you is that we can see prepositional verbs developing over time, and that prepositional verbs as a category might be fuzzy. There is some issues with how to actually identify them, how to classify them, how to distinguish them from other uses, other verb prepositional combinations, but that it does seem like they have some sort of distinct profile, at least the verbs that I included here, which are, of course, also the prototypical, some of the most prototypical prepositional verbs. Great. I hope I still have time. I kind of forgot to check when we started. But before I move on to the second case study, just let me wrap this up by pointing out some limitations. I've already mentioned that this manual distinction between what counts as an adjunct and complement and a prepositional verb is, of course, problematic. Imposing such a categorical distinction between for a phenomenon which is somehow gradient and fuzzy also comes with issues. There is also issues pertaining to the fact that some verbs have multiple different combinations, like look or laugh. There's also changes in verb meaning, which make it a bit problematic. But still, I do think that the data shows quite nicely, and I hope you would agree, that prepositional verbs are kind of special, and that we can actually see this in historical data as well. Right. I'll move on to the next case study, which is not about prepositional patterns on their own, but about prepositional patterns in competition, in variation with nominal phrases, with nominal patterns. And the specific case I looked into is NPPP competition with expressions of time, which isn't usually included in the typical NPPP alternations, like the dative alternation or the genitive alternation. And as I will show, it's also a bit different to those, but it's still an interesting case study to look at, I would say. Right. So what I'm talking about when I say NPPP competition with expressions of time is cases such as the ones that you see on the slide here. So nominal patterns like that day or that week or that year, competing against prepositional phrases like at that day or in that week or in that year or at that hour on Monday, and so on and so forth. In present-day English, if you look at previous studies, you find that these are, with such time expressions, prepositional phrases are usually more frequent than noun phrases. So these instances like that day or that year do exist in present-day English, but this is a case where prepositional phrases have increased quite a bit or constitute the more frequent variant today. And what we also see in present-day English is that there is some variation in position, and that both occur clause early and clause late, but medial position is less frequent. Now, in the history of English, what seems to have happened, or what has been suggested, is that prepositional patterns were present in Old English already. There is an example from Beowulf here, so a very famous example, where in a gloomy night, where the time expression includes a preposition in Old English already. However, in Old English, in older texts, we do still find more nominal phrases for time expressions, which are typically case marked, so which typically carry oblique case, genitive, or instrumental, or also dative, typically. And the idea then is that with the loss of case marking, with this general move from synthetic to analytic, prepositional patterns increased from Middle English onwards. Right. So what I tried to address in this study is whether such a change can actually be seen in the data, because relatively little quantitative investigations of this particular case of variation exist so far. And in addition to just seeing how this change plays out, I was interested in which factors impact the choice of these variants over time. So when do prepositional phrases get chosen over nominal phrases for time expressions? And does this also change over time? The particular hypotheses that I pursued here are that, yes, there is an increase in prepositional time expressions from Middle English onwards. And second, in terms of factors influencing this choice, I was mostly interested in whether this can be linked to complexity. So what I was interested in is whether expressions of time and this variation reflect the complexity principle formulated by Rodenberg, who stated that more explicit grammatical alternatives tend to be preferred in cognitively more complex environments. So in our case, the assumption would be that prepositional phrases as the more explicit variant would be used more frequently in any sort of complex context, whereas noun phrases would be used in less complex, more predictable, easier environments. There is some support for this assumption, or actually quite a lot. One of those is a recent study by Natalia Levshina on variation between home and at home, where it is shown that the prepositional pattern is indeed preferred in cognitively more complex contexts. So, for example, the prepositional pattern is preferred in instances where there's a great distance between the verb and home. So if it's, for example, stay comfortably at home, compared to stay comfortably home, which isn't as as likely. There's also an indication that predictability plays a role. So again, association strength. If a verb occurs with a lot of different, if home occurs with a lot of different verbs, then the prepositional phrase is preferred. There's also there's additional evidence for this effect from Dutch transitives in a study by Paypups et al., who again show that complexity matters in the choice between noun phrases versus prepositional phrases. For example, in cases like search something versus search for something, they show that length of objects plays a role. So the longer an object is, the more often it will be used with a preposition to make things easier, to help processing. And again, that predictability plays a role. So if you have a lot of different prepositions being used with a verb, then preposition, well, that was a bit confusing. In any case, in combinations of verbs with nouns, if there's a lot of variation, then you tend to get prepositional uses. Never mind. So in sum, what these and related studies show is that complexity, more complex environments seem to be linked with more prepositional, more explicit uses. What I then did to test this for time expressions is I again took a subset from this larger data set of noun phrases and prepositional phrases in these three corpora. And this time I selected 14 different time head nouns. So again, I restricted the data based on a list on selected lexical items to make it more feasible. So I chose nouns like afternoon, day, hour, and so on and so forth, which were tested in all periods and in both of these patterns, in both noun and prepositional phrases. And importantly, I restricted the prepositions. So the prepositional phrases could only involve at, in, on, and upon, but not, for example, for, because there is no real alternation in cases of duration, for example. So stay for a long time doesn't really alternate with stay a long time. Well, it does actually. But anyway, I restricted the data in this way to make the data more feasible, to ensure that there is actually some alternation going on. I then manually pruned this data set, so excluded all the instances where there isn't really interchangeability, and that left me with a total data set of around 9,000 instances, of which roughly half is nominal phrases and half prepositional phrases. Again, I coded these instances for a variety of different factors, including time, period, and again, position. So is it pre-verbal or post-verbal? And in addition, a number of complexity measures that have been mentioned in the literature. So one measure is length in number of words. So how long is the time expression? For example, that day versus that very long and hot summer day. I also coded for distance between the verb and the time expression in number of words. So how far away is the time expression from the verb, something like talked to their neighbors from across the road on Monday would be quite distant, whereas talked on Monday would be directly adjacent, so very short distance. In addition, I included a measure of predictability. So again, this type of association strength. How often does a particular verb appear with a particular time expression? So does talk often occur with on Monday, or is there a lot of variation? Does come at a particular hour? Is that a close combination, and so on and so forth? So just checking, using a particular association strength measure to see, are there clear associations between particular verbs and particular time nouns? And finally, I also included a measure of morphosyntactic complexity. So does the time expression include a subordinate clause, for example, and a subordinate phrase, and so on and so forth? Right. What you see here then is the just general frequency distribution again. And what you can see is that there seems to be a slight increase of prepositional phrases compared to noun phrases over time. So there is some increase from around half of instances to, slightly more, so 55% in late modern English. But this increase isn't super striking, so an increase of a few percent is not super significant. And in addition, if we look at the distribution over individual text and decades, so if we look a bit more closely at the development, we see that there's quite a lot of fluctuation going on. So what these results already suggest is that, again, there is no sweeping increase of prepositional phrases with time expressions over time, but that it's a bit more nuanced, that it's less straightforward. What I did then to check, to assess which factors influence this variation and whether that changes over time, is I conducted a regression analysis again, where the dependent variable is noun phrase versus prepositional phrase use, so choice between nominal versus prepositional. And I used the variables that I mentioned earlier, so time, as well as position, and these complexity measures as fixed effects, and also included interaction terms between time and these variables to see whether there is a change in the importance of these factors over time. Now, what we find, what the results show, is a bit mixed. Time actually doesn't show up as significant, so corresponding to the frequency distributions that I've just shown you, it doesn't really seem like prepositional phrases take over, at least not significantly. There is no significant effect of morphological complexity and also none of association strength. But we do find a significant effect of position. So pre-verbal position is more closely associated with prepositional phrases, whereas noun phrases are usually are more frequent, more likely in post-verbal position. Prepositional phrases are also more frequent if there's a greater distance, but length actually has the opposite effect as expected. So longer time expressions actually typically occur as noun phrases rather than prepositional phrases. So to sum up, prepositional phrases, prepositional time expressions like on that day are typically associated with pre-verbal position, with greater distance, so further removed position in a clause, and shorter expressions, whereas noun phrases are typically associated with post-verbal position, close position, close adjacency to the verb, and longer time expressions. There's some interaction with time here, and that position comes to play a greater role over time, and some effect of some interaction between time and length. Now, these results are a bit surprising in the sense that the complexity measures that are included show quite mixed effects. Distance corresponds to what we would expect, but length doesn't. And association, strength, and morphological complexity don't really seem to play a role. I'll come back to this in a few slides, but what I argue, or what I think might explain this, and what I'm pursuing in a different study at the moment, is that there's a connection between these results and ambiguity. So well, what I would suggest, or what I'd like to test in a bit more detail, is whether we can explain these length effects, for example, with the loss of case marking and increased ambiguity. But I'll come back to this in a second. What I did in addition to this regression model is conducting a conditional random forest analysis, which essentially just allows us to check which factors are most important, which are most relevant in this choice. And the benefit, the advantage of using this tool, using this method, is that we can also include head noun lemma as a factor, which is a bit problematic with regressions because there's too many variable levels. And what we see in this analysis then is that lemma, so head noun lemma, whether it's afternoon or time or hour, really is most influential. So some time expressions, some time nouns like afternoon, morrow, season, time, or winter have a clear preference for prepositional phrase expression, whereas others like day, night, or week have a preference for noun phrase expression. So what we can conclude or see from these results is that, yes, there is some tiny increase in frequency of prepositional phrases over time, over noun phrases, but that this change is a lot less convincing or straightforward as we might have assumed if we really take this change from synthetic to analytic very seriously, which maybe nobody actually would presume in this categorical way. But still, what these results nicely are in line with is previous work by, for example, Benedikt Smečený, who also shows that the history of English isn't really characterized by such a clear, steady, straightforward move towards more analytic expressions and less synthetic ones, but that it's actually less dramatic, less straightforward, and that there is a lot more variability. So the first point that I think we can make quite nicely based on this study is that that the development of synthetic to analytic is a lot more complex, is a lot more nuanced, and it really depends a lot on the particular phenomenon, the particular part of the English grammar that you look at. And second, that lexical biases really emerge as quite strong predictors here. So while we can treat this time alternation as an alternation like others, like the dative alternation or the genitive alternation, it's clear that individual nouns have quite distinct preferences. So I would say there's still something going on a more abstract level. We do have this choice between nominal versus prepositional, but at the same time, there is lower level, there is sort of more lexical item dependent preferences, which we should definitely take into account. And finally, to come back to this question of complexity, as I've said, there's quite mixed results. So the study doesn't really confirm very clearly that prepositional phrases with time expressions are used in more complex environments. There is some ways in which we could explain this, for example, distinguishing between processing versus production, complexity, and so on and so forth. But what I'm most interested in, as I said, is whether these mixed results or whether these results that don't quite correspond to what we might expect might be due to some ambiguity issues in Middle English specifically. So as I said, one hypothesis that I'd like to pursue in a further study is whether prepositional phrases might be most useful, might be most beneficial exactly with very short time expressions in initial position, because they reduce the risk of garden path interpretations. Just to give you an example, in a case like that day, if this occurs in initial position without any further material, you could theoretically also interpret this as a time subject. So something like that day was when she was born. Using a preposition using a preposition instead of a nominal phrase here, like on that day she was born, excludes that subject interpretation from the start. So it kind of reduces the risk of going down a garden path from the outset. So the argument that I'd like to address in a study that I'm conducting right now is whether we can find evidence for that. So whether initial position and short time expressions are really more likely to be used with prepositions, and more specifically, whether this effect is stronger in Middle English as well as late Old English, where case is lost and where this ambiguity increases. So in Old English, that day would still be marked with an oblique case, meaning that it would be recognizable as a time adjunct instead of a subject, for example. But once that case is lost, once case marking disappears, there would be increased ambiguity between different interpretations. And precisely in that context, prepositions would be helpful. Right, but as I said, this is merely a hypothesis at this point. So we'll see where this goes. To conclude, what this case study has shown is the diachronic development of time expressions in the history of English. And the basic takeaway message is that there isn't any sweeping change here, but rather quite a stable variation, that we get strong lexical effects, and in addition, potentially some reflection of complexity linked to ambiguity. And I think I'll stop here. I'm not sure how much time I've taken up. I'll just very briefly come to my general conclusions, which essentially is just that looking into the history of prepositions and prepositional phrases, also in relation to nominal patterns, is really interesting and offers a lot of food for investigation. But there's also quite a lot of challenges that come with looking at these phenomena from a sort of bird's eye view, because the group of prepositional patterns is just super heterogeneous. Prepositional verbs are something very different to time expressions. There's various different alternations around, there's various different phenomena, and it's questionable whether they really form some sort of more abstract construction at all. So my sort of general conclusion from all of this would be that things are more complex. Prepositional patterns are extremely exciting and interesting, and there is a lot more that can be looked at with them, but they're also way more challenging than I ever expected, which is maybe a nice takeaway from a long project, that there is still a lot to actually look at. And I'll stop at this. I'm sorry for probably having taken on a lot more time than I should have.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you very much for the timing. The timing was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.